Happy Sabbath, everybody. You know, the one thing about Sabbath that is should always be the case, especially when you go to church, is that Sabbath is meant for happiness, to be happy. And so I encourage everybody to smile more on the Sabbath because it kind of shows how you feel on the inside. So if you catch somebody that looks a little bit too serious, and it could be they have something serious to think about, but just remind them there is rest in the Lord today. You know, the song we sang, first hymnal, the title is Great is Thy Faithfulness. And the words are pretty powerful if you pay attention to them. And I would ask you, do you think that the author of the song just kind of figured, oh, this word and that word just kind of rhymes, matches, and so, or do you think there was an experience or experiences that motivated that person to write that song? And how do you come up with a title like that? Unless you know for a fact that when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to God and the Holy Spirit, great is their faithfulness. But it's real easy to forget. We have a picture hanging in one of our halls, and it says there's a little girl that Jesus is holding. And on the bottom it says that He will never leave you nor forsake you. Is that the same as great is thy faithfulness? Yes, it is. It is exactly the same thing. But sometimes we ourselves have a different perspective of God's faithfulness. Because sometimes we don't really feel, perhaps, that we need Him. Things are going good. Everything's hunky-dory. And you don't really have any issues, any problems. And so you don't really need God. So it may be that the great is thy faithfulness is not necessarily applying to you right now because He's already blessed you and things are going well. It almost seems that the time that we realize that God will never leave us nor forsake us, or the time when we can claim that He is faithful, are times when we are in deep need. Right? Doesn't it seem that way? We really need Him. And finally, something breaks through and we are able to know His faithfulness. But when everything is going okay, you just kind of like, that's in the back burner because you don't really need Him to fix anything. Everything's already hunky-dory. But as Brother Oscar said, we're living in a world where this is a battleground between good and evil. And there are enemies shooting darts at us. There is Satan who walks around like a roaring lion ready to do what? To devour us. And so while we may be content, that doesn't necessarily mean that there may not be something around the corner that's going to test us. Around the corner where something is going to happen and all of a sudden we need that faithfulness from God because now we're in need. Right? Some of us have already experienced that. Some of us have already asked God. And some of us can already claim, such as a songwriter, great is thy faithfulness. And if you go back and look at the words, that person, you can sense, you can feel, you can understand that there was something that happened in their lives that they needed God's faithfulness, and He delivered. In the darkest hour of people, that's when we look for His faithfulness, right? In our darkest hour, that's when we need Him not to forsake us or to forget us or leave us. But what if we weren't ready for something that was going to happen? What if we're just kind of, moving along, everything's great. And then all of a sudden, what do we do when something tragic, when something bad happens in our lives, when something sad happens in our lives, and we've been just, today, just humming along. And then tomorrow, it's a whole different story in our lives. Wow. What do we do? Do we react to the circumstances? Do we say, oh, what happened? What kind of change happens in our lives when we go from everything being good to suddenly something tragic happens? And it's incredible, but the promises of God being faithful, that He would never leave us or forsake us, applies whether things are going really good or things are going really bad, except that we really want to leech on when things are really bad. When things are really good, we just take it for granted. This morning, we were having a conversation with Norma's niece, Marie, and she just came back from a John Maxwell conference in Florida, and she was asked to speak in the conference because her circumstances of the past were very challenging. Growing up were very challenging. And her little talk was about the fact that when Norma's brothers, it was a dual wedding, or I guess you call it a dual wedding, right? What do you call it? Double wedding? It wasn't a wedding? Just a wedding. In Mexico, they had a car crash. They, you know how it is in the United States when you're coming across a steep curve, there's warning signs that says lower your speed to like 35, 40 miles an hour, and there's all kinds of warning signs because there's a steep curve. And if you don't do that, you could run off the road. Huh? Yes. Well, that's what happened in their case. They were going to a wedding. The problem is that the warning sign, somebody had hit it and it was on the floor. And they didn't see it. And so instead of making the curve, he went straight. It was at night. Couldn't see very well. And they went between two trees and hit a third, and the car just kind of shook as the final crash brought them to a stop. And in that crash, Norma's sister, Mary, some of you remember Mary, older sister, she suffered the most, that she was put into the hospital, and they thought she was going to die. Now, this was back in the time when technology was not as good as today, medical technology and advances. We're talking about Mexico. The first thing that Mexicans do, the law, when something like that happens, is they arrest the driver until everything is sorted out. That's why I don't recommend you renting a car in Mexico because without insurance, because if that ever happens, you'll be arrested until things are sorted out. And if somebody's killed or somebody's hurt, bad news. And so at the hospital, they said that she wasn't going to make it, but somehow, and she was in a coma for a very long time, she survived. But she came back home. Oh, and by the way, the doctors wanted to pull the plug, but Norma's mama, bless her heart, she said, no, you can't do that. And so they came back home after a while, but she had brain damage. And during the time in her life, things happened, and she got pregnant, and she had a choice to make. The choice was, do you keep the baby or do you not? Because the mother has brain damage, and it's hard, right? It's hard enough to raise a child, much less when you don't have the capacity to do so. And as a consequence, they fought through it, and Marie was born. And then Marie, of course, was raised up by her grandma because her mother couldn't. Mary passed away not too long ago, bless her heart. And she grew up. She had kids. She was a single mom. She overcame a lot of things. And now she's a successful businesswoman, very successful, happy. Her kids are grown, very, very nice children. We love them. And grandchildren now. She's a grandma. And she's only, 46. Here we are, just barely a grandpa, and I'm already getting ready to retire. So she has a long way to go in enjoying them. So she gave a talk about her experiences like that growing up and how now in this chapter of her life she has this success. But as a consequence of the tragedies that came out, she would not have been here if it wasn't for the decisions that were made at the hospital and that were made during the pregnancy. And there was a lady there in the same audience that texted Marie afterwards. And she said, you know, you gave me a lot of encouragement and a lot of hope. My daughter was in an accident and now she has brain damage also. But your talk gave me the hope that I needed to hear, that even if you're dumped in the trash, God can still make something great out of you. The lady took her testimony, Marie's testimony, as God's faithfulness in her life. Because she needed that faithfulness. She needed it. And Marie, through her experience, gave it to her. You see, this is one of the reasons why testimonies are so important. And this is one of the reasons why, even though everything may be going well in your lives, you don't know what's coming up next week, tomorrow, you don't know. We just take everything for granted that today everything is fine. But how are you prepared to deal with the circumstances that may affect your life? Do you hold on to God's faithfulness in the good times as well as the bad times when you really, really want it? Or do you just take it for granted in the good times, and in the bad times you search for it and search for it and search for it? This is something that in Jesus' time, during the week of Easter, when the week, and this was his final week on earth, as far as fully human, before the crucifixion, before being arrested and beaten horribly, he was hanging out with the disciples just like any other time. And the disciples were all acting really, jubilant and happy. It was a celebration. I mean, even today we celebrate Easter every year. And we celebrate it because of its significance, right? But at the time that it was happening, the first Easter, the disciples had no idea. They weren't prepared for what was going to happen. However, it wasn't Jesus' fault. Because Jesus, throughout his ministry with them, he had been preparing them, right? He would tell them things. This is going to happen. I have to suffer through these things. In other words, he kept telling them what was going to happen, and they, what? Treated the day like any other day. And Jesus knew that what was about to happen that week would crush them like they've never been crushed before. Because although they should have been aware and prepared, because Jesus was trying to do that, it just didn't happen. They were so preoccupied with being part of this movement, preoccupied with wanting to be on the right hand or the left hand, the vice president or the secretary of state when Jesus takes over, that the things that Jesus were talking about didn't even make sense to them. It was like, what? What are you talking about? We're about to become royalty. Sometimes in our lives, we are ill-prepared for things that come our way that challenge even our faith. Even the Bible says that even the elect would be challenged in their faith, right? Because the things that may happen in this world, and nothing is off the table, folks. Nothing is off the table. Whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're healthy, whether you're not, nothing is off the table when it comes to attacks. We can get attacked from anywhere, even where we least expect it. And the question is, do we understand God's faithfulness to the degree that even though our circumstances may change abruptly, we do not challenge that faithfulness. We do not doubt that faithfulness. We do not experience a doubt that basically crushes our Christian walk, our Christianity, our identity. Because we see so many times that happens in folks' lives. And the disciples were about to experience that. Can you imagine what would have happened if the disciples would have been crushed to the degree that they could not establish the Christian church because they were wiped away by the experience. Can you imagine that? It wasn't until Jesus appeared again. They were not out of the water. They were not in the clear. They expected to be captured and be tortured and be killed because they were associates of Jesus. All of a sudden, in the good part of the times when they were associated with Jesus and everybody loved them, they were happy about that. Yeah, man, yeah, I'm right. I'm with him. But when it came time to the darkest hour of that week, what were they saying? I don't know him. I don't know him. I'm not with him. Why? That's horrible. But look at who it was, the very people that walked with Jesus. Now look at us here. If you don't have that great understanding that God will never leave you nor forsake you, no matter what the circumstances, we ourselves too may be prone to denying the Lord. And that's horrible because we're ill prepared. Even though we are educated. I mean, listen, for the past 4,000 years before Jesus, there was a lot of things that were given to us about the character of Jesus, a character of God. And all of a sudden, God appears on earth for 33 and a half years, and the disciples have written about him and others about what Jesus came to do, the things he said, the experiences he had with people, the miracles he had with people. And we have this. Do you think that that's more of an advantage than at the time of Jesus to reinforce our faith because we have the New Testament? We should. We should understand all the things and hold them dear to our heart so that our foundation is solid. We have the necessary ingredients, just like the apostles had the necessary ingredients to be able to overcome, but yet Jesus said, they're not ready. And so in Jesus' darkest hour, he was more concerned about their well-being than his own, even though he knew what was going to happen to him, right? He knew that he was on death row. He knew that he had to go through this horrible experience in order to take away our sin. He knew. And it wasn't just about the disciples. It was about us. It was about us. You know, there are certain things that keep people going. When people are interviewed in war, for example, you'll hear someone say, yeah, I had it real rough. I was on the brink of death. But it was the thought of going back home, the thought of my family, of holding my children that kept me going. You see, there's always something that'll keep you going, even in the darkest hour. And God's faithfulness should be that. But if you're not knowledgeable about that, if you don't know what that entails, you could easily lose that because you never really had it. It's kind of like it was there, but it wasn't really there. It was in your mind, but it wasn't in your heart because it had never been challenged before. But it could tomorrow. It could next week. And the question is, are we like the songwriter, prepared to know that even in our darkest hour, great is thy faithfulness? Do you remember the song, the other song? There's, what is it called? It is well with my soul. Do you know the story behind that? How many don't know the story behind that? This individual had a family, his wife and I believe a daughter. And they were going to go to travel somewhere, and they were there by ship. And he had to stay behind and go later for whatever reason. And so his wife and his daughter went ahead of him. In the ship that his wife and his family was with, there was trouble in the ocean, bad weather, and the ship sunk. Now, there was no iPhones or cell phones. There was no way of knowing what happened, who was saved and who was lost. And so they had the bodies and they had the survivors located at a certain place. And he was on his way over there in another ship to find out whether or not they were alive. And he wrote the song that no matter what happens, no matter what the circumstances, whether I find them dead or whether I find them still alive, he understood the bigger picture. And as far as he was concerned, it is well with my soul. You see, when we take an approach where our faith is so great that even our circumstances cannot shake it, God's faithfulness pours out in a stronger and mightier way to you. If you doubt or you're wishy-washy, and by the way, Jesus doesn't like wishy-washy. He really doesn't. You notice that in his stories, he always says, your faith has made you whole. Remember what he told the centurion? Wow, I have never seen such great faith in all of Israel. And do you remember what he told Peter when he was walking on the water and then he fell? He said, why did you have to doubt? You see, we have to learn and understand that there are two worlds overlapping each other here. Now, while we may only be able to see one world, the other world, the spiritual world, is also upon us. And in the spiritual world, because we can't see, we don't know what's happening. And the evilness that exists is also happening in that spiritual world. And it's influencing things so that we can be attacked in many different ways. Do you remember the story of, who was it? Was it Isaiah or Elijah? When they were on the hill, and the servant says, oh, look at the Assyrian army. They're surrounding us, and there's a lot of enemy. Who was it? Elisha. And what did Elisha do? He asked God, Lord, take away his veil from his eyes. And then when the veil removed, what did he see? He saw angels. They're ready to protect them. And he's like, whoa. You see, if we would be able to see, like Thomas said, unless I see, unless I touch, I'll believe it. And Jesus says, you see, you touch, you believe. But more blessed are those that believe and have not seen. Greater is their faith. So you see, folks, even though Easter describes the tragedy and describes the things that happen, it is not the end of the story. And so if tragedy were to happen in our lives and circumstances were to change where we are shaken to the core, you must remember that God's faithfulness is still there. You must remember that He will walk us through it until we come out. Do you remember the Daniel's 3 friends? When they were thrown into the fiery furnace, or they were about to be thrown, and the Nebuchadnezzar people said, you need to kneel down and worship the idol, or we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. And they said, well, we won't. And they said, well, we're going to throw you in. Let's see if God can save you. And they said, oh, God can save us. But even if He doesn't, we're not going to worship that. You see, when we have an understanding of the faithfulness that God gives us, the promise that when He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, is true, it's a fact, it's a promise, you can take it to the bank. When we accept that, our circumstances, when they become bleak, will be something that we are able to handle. Because it is not us. That's why Jesus says very clearly, if you're ever attacked for ministering for me, for witnessing for me, if you're ever attacked, they're not attacking you. They're attacking Him. Why? Because when you come to that realization and that understanding, You don't have to take responsibility for that. Jesus will take care of it, right? Who handles the battles? God does. Let him handle our battles. And even if things are bleak, that's why that lady's response to Marie is so powerful. When in her mind, she says, even if you're thrown to the trash, God can still make something great of you. Wow. Can you get any lower than that? So as we approach Easter, folks, it's not just about the crucifixion, the punishment. It's not about just the resurrection. It's not just the story and the celebration and the holiday. It's about God's faithfulness, that even while we were sinners, he loved us and came to save us. Jesus is the one. He's the shepherd that goes out and looks for the lost sheep. Jesus is the one. And all the prophecies of the previous 4,000 years prior to Jesus' time, all the prophecies came to fruition in Jesus. His life, his death, his resurrection, and now he's representing us in heaven. Can you doubt his faithfulness? When you know it all, when you understand it all, when you clearly see, when you discover Jesus, you will know that he will never leave you nor forsake you, even in your greatest time of need. Amen.